Welcome to Sidebar, Bracewell's podcast devoted to government enforcement and investigations, corporate compliance, and white-collar criminal defense. I'm Matthew Nielsen.
And I'm Phil Bazanton.
And we are your host, and we are both partners at Bracewell LLP, where we represent companies, boards of directors, and individuals in all manners of litigation, investigation, and enforcement actions. Phil, who do we have as our guest today?
So today we have an outstanding guest who's going to join us in a deeper cybersecurity dive into unique risks and challenges presented by ransomware attacks. Matthew, we've talked about cybersecurity issues before, and I know they make you uneasy. So rest assured, I am secure and safe in my basement bunker, ready to ride out whatever catastrophe might be troubling you. But maybe our guest, Seth DuCharme from Bracewell's Government Investigations and Enforcement Practice Group in New York, will give us even more confidence. Among his many accomplishments, Seth was recently the acting United States Attorney for the Eastern District of New York, so Brooklyn in the House. He also had various leadership positions in the Department of Justice and in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn. And important for us today, he worked to establish the National Security and Cybercrime section at the Department of Justice. So he knows much, much more about ransomware than either you or I combined. So it's great to have you, Seth. Welcome to Sidebar.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be speaking to you both again.
All right. So in the last really few months, this concept, this issue of ransomware has, I think, elevated from something that was in the know among people who deal with cybersecurity matters and data breach matters regularly. And it's just kind of exploded into something that is mainstream media coverage. Everyone knows what ransomware is now, or at least knows the word ransomware, right. Which maybe is an important distinction. So can you just quickly summarize and explain what exactly is ransomware?
Sure, I'm happy to, Phil. And I think you're exactly right. It's become a household word. That's a scary thing, but ultimately it's probably a good thing that the conversation, around the kitchen table in so many households and certainly boardrooms now is about ransomware and what does it mean, for me as an individual or for a corporation. So in simplest terms, ransomware is accessing, a computer or a network of computers, and through technical means holding data for ransom through some type of encryption technology. So, many of our listeners may be familiar on a personal level with encrypting a file for their own privacy reasons. Maybe it's a PDF file or some other type of file, and they take the reasonable step of setting a password so they can get access to that file. What ransomware essentially does is it encrypts many or even all files, that it finds on a computer or within a network, creates a private key, and then whoever has perpetrated that ransomware on the computer or the network makes that key ideally available for a price. And I say ideally because there's no guarantees that the key will be provided upon the payment. But it's essentially locking you out of your house, changing the locks, and then charging you to get a key back into your house. On the level of a computer or a network of computers.
All right. So this concept of getting into someone's house, changing the lock, and then locking someone out, it seems like the first step there is the perpetrator gets into the house.
Yeah.
Is there anything unique about ransomware where, how the bad guys get in compared to sort of any other of the sort of types of data breach that exist that certainly Matthew and I have talked about before, and I know we've worked on before? Is there something unique to how ransomware attacks happen?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of ways in, just like there's a couple of ways into your, the physical space of your house and business. Sometimes people leave the doors unlocked. Sometimes they leave keys where they shouldn't, and hopefully those kinds of analogies are useful to our listeners, but let me just give you.
To Phil, as you can tell, he's in a bunker about 500 feet down in the earth.
Yeah,
one way in, one way out.
Yeah,
My eyes are on the door.
Well, that would be the appropriate way to think about your computer network. I mean, to answer your question more directly, there's a number of different ways that ransomware can end up on a computer or on a computer network. Most of them, the majority of them, at least based on some recent conversations that we've had with our experts and consultants on the technical side, come down to the failures of the kind of good cyber hygiene habits that folks have really been sounding the alarm over for a decade. So, for example, if you've been to some of these cybersecurity conferences, a lot of the 1 hour presentations end with, and that's why you shouldn't click on links. So, I think it's well known by now that if you get an unfamiliar email encouraging you to click on a link, whether it's suggesting it's a cute picture of a kitten or some free vacation or whatever they're trying to entice you, and perhaps that's been engineered by looking at your social media to confirm that you like kittens and free trips to Hawaii. Some people find that irresistible. So clicking on a link basically is an invitation to another computer that's out there to do things, to your computer. Innocuously, it would be show you a picture of a kitten or, a Hawaiian resort. But with ransomware, it's essentially an invitation to infect your computer with malware. So that's one way. It's a common way. It's almost embarrassing to repeat it because people have heard it so much, but it's a real thing. And people have a hard time resisting the impulse to click on things that they think will be immediately gratifying and rewarding, whether it's an image or an opportunity. Another way is that, as creatures of habit with limited memories, many people are, in the habit of using the same password for multiple accounts. So, you get your free subscription to some newsletter of a hobby interest. Maybe it's your kitten newsletter, and you say, well, I'm going to use kitten 123 for that. And geez, wouldn't it be convenient if I used kitten 123 for my work logon and my bank account and my medical records and my family photos? Because then I'll just have one password to remember.
Phil, you're going to have to change your password now.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I've revealed that.
No, this is for my 7-year-old's birthday. He watched Spaceballs, which of course has the original media call out to terrible passwords. And changing, the environment in which we grow up in and the things that people internalize. My 7-year-old watching Spaceballs hears two characters say that their passwords are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and he looks at me and says, "That's a stupid password." So this is things.
That's what he found stupid about Spaceballs.
Yeah, everything else he thought was brilliant because it is brilliant.
It's true.
Seth, I think that's a great summary for, that ransomware, even though it's a totally different type of attack that affects individuals and businesses in ways that they haven't been affected before, that it's essentially the doorway in is the same as many other types of cyber attack.
Yeah.
Which suggests that all the stuff that people do and warn about and train against still has shortcomings. So is there anything that can be done or discussed or highlighted to say, come on, everybody, it's time to take this a little bit more seriously. Here are things you can do beyond having different passwords and beyond clicking on pictures of kittens?
Yeah, I think that the strategy is of layered defenses of different types to protect from ransomware or other types of intrusions. And, some of those layers are passive, like the lock on your door, and some of them are active, like maybe the German Shepherd in your living room, which is going to, sniff around for burglars. And, and maybe there's, floodlights outside your house to illuminate things so you can peek out, and maybe there's a shotgun in your closet. People are going to have to make different decisions about what reasonable layers of security look like for them individually and also, in cyberspace. And so I think that part of it is developing good habits such that they become second nature and therefore no longer a burden and an inconvenience. The way many of us, at least me growing up, many of us didn't wear our seatbelts. It was an inconvenience. It wasn't cool to put your seatbelt on. Now it's hard, it's hard to find people who don't immediately put their seatbelt on when they get in the car. So we can acclimate ourselves to inconveniences, that have that materially improve our ability to survive the bad thing when the bad thing happens. So part of that is the training and the messaging, the building the resilience in the human component of this, so people are alert to it. It's also taking away the shame of victimization. So if the bad thing happens to you, or you can't help yourself and you click that kitten, you self-report. And you say, hey, look, I had a lapse. I clicked on this thing. I think there's a problem. So you communicate, what you see. I mean, some of this stuff sounds trite, but I think a lot of my thinking about cybersecurity and how we respond to it was really informed by my experience in counterterrorism. And it's a form of terrorism, and extortion. It really is. I mean, even the images, and I know you guys have probably seen them, but some of the images associated with these ransomware attacks, like a very scary, monster face that pops up on your screen, it's terrifying. And the fact that you've been cut off from all the things that you love, the pictures of your kids and your files and it's very scary. So what did we say in counterterrorism? We said, over-report. If you see something, say something. And sounds silly, but it's really true. I think with cybersecurity, more directly to your question, people are especially afraid of the unknown, so you've got to have more conversations like the one we're having today. So it becomes more normal to talk about it. We build in a certain amount of resilience. So when it happens, people don't overreact and panic, but they respond proportionally. So I'm a big believer in focusing on the human element. But that's not to say that there aren't a lot of, technical measures, that can be doing a lot of the sniffing for you. Just like, when you set your burglar alarm when you leave, so the burglar alarm keeps an eye on the house. There's software that monitors activity on a network. There's software that updates you on patches. There's a lot of, there are a lot of layers of technical assistance that individuals and corporations can use. But I think if we're not thinking about it and talking about it and evolving with it, which is what's happening now to a large degree, I think we're always going to be behind the curve and we're always going to be vulnerable. So I think it's got to be both the human element and the technical element, and understanding how those things come together.
So Seth, could you talk a little bit about who are the people that are actually engaging in ransomware? And I will say the only mildly entertaining part of ransomware is the names that come up with their gangs. Mm-hmm. Because they are straight out of an Austin Powers movie.
Yeah.
But they're not funny on what they're doing. And like you said, they really are operating a terrorist organization. So talk about kind of who are the people that are doing this and what are their real goals? Is it really money, or is it some kind of other means to get information?
Yeah, well, here's the unfortunately broad response to your question. With the availability of ransomware and ransomware as a service, it's a weapon that is available to pretty much anybody with access to the internet and the desire to use it. I mean, we've seen a lot of attention focused lately on criminal elements, in countries that give safe harbor to them. Like Russia. So there are organized criminal networks based in Russia and other places that essentially appear to have deals with the host nations, where as long as we don't, do this domestically, we will be given, safe harbor to operate. And it makes it very difficult for us, to reach them, law enforcement to reach them in the US. So I think a lot of the buzz has been about the fact that we have now with more confidence attributed and identified ransomware attacks to, organized crime elements in former Soviet bloc countries who are making a lot of money launching the attacks. But that's, like I said, it's that's not the whole pool of potential adversaries because of the availability of ransomware as a service. So, if we think back 10 years and you look how, maybe Hollywood or the media conceptualized this and how we thought of it, you imagined sort of like a boy genius in a hoodie, sitting in a dark room over a laptop writing code and kind of engaged in a real-time attack on a network with cat and mouse, in the system. And it was dramatic and it was exciting. And, it's probably happened. But you don't need to be a boy genius, writing your own code now, unfortunately. You can buy the stuff off the shelf. And so if you want to use it to extort money out of people, which is the financial motive, you can do it. If you want to do it for unfair business advantage to a competitor through unscrupulous means, you can do it. If you want to punish, an ex-spouse or something by making their life miserable, it's available. So, some of these groups feel so secure that they take credit for their attacks. They're proud of it. They feel unreachable. They post social media pictures of themselves, driving Lamborghinis and making money and feel untouchable.
Almost branding it.
Yeah, exactly. But if you're like, DOJ recently announced they've got this like cyber task force set up, and if you were imagine like, okay, what's the target set, we're going to focus on, it's a pretty daunting view. If you're law enforcement and your mission has been to eradicate, ransomware as a material or even existential threat to individuals and corporations in the US, you're looking at a very large potential target pool.
But if you talk about it as terrorism or something as an existential threat, then, I know this is sort of a big picture question, but what are the ideal appropriate defense resources to throw at it from like a policy perspective?
Yeah. So first of all, I think recalibrating what is truly an existential threat to an individual or a corporation is important, because it's only in the rarest instances, I think will a ransomware attack be truly an existential threat. It might cause a lot of pain, on the front end, but it is not the equivalent of a bomb on a subway car or a bomb in Penn Station. It does not immediately. We can make exceptions to this, particularly in the healthcare industry and hospitals. Where there can be real threat to human life. But generally speaking, most people who are the victims or corporations who are the victims of ransomware attacks will survive. And I think that's critically important, because how we think about the threat affects our behavior. And so if you do the prep work on the front end, you can mitigate that. But fundamentally, you're probably going to survive a ransomware attack, whether you pay or whether you don't. Fundamentally, you're probably going to survive.
I want to ask you about one thing you just said, because it's really important. You said if you pay or if you don't.
Yeah.
So two different paths. I sort of makes sense. Like any ransom, purportedly you make a payment, things go back to normal, and you're out some money. But because this isn't a physical person being held hostage with a bag over his head in a basement,
right?
Okay, what happens if you don't pay? What are the risks?
All right. No, that's a great question. And you have some say in shaping your own destiny there in the preparation phase. So what forward looking and forward thinking, individuals and corporations have been doing now for quite some time is building in redundancies. It sounds like a cliche to say, back up your systems, back up your information, compartmentalize those backups, insulate them from vectors of attack. That can mitigate substantially against at least one type of attack, which is, if the attack is, we think that there's information that you need to have access to do your business, to remain functional, to keep the lights on and the doors open and the business running. And we take that away from you. And the ransomware attacker is thinking, okay, they must pay to get it back. Well, if you if you have redundancies or you have backups, then you can say, well, you took that, but I can still operate. And the only way to mitigate, to get yourself in that position, is to make the investment, time, energy, money, technology, resources. But you can do that on the front end. Have backups. The problem, there, and not to be too negative, is that there's another type of attack, which is not only are we going to keep it from you, but we're going to give it to everybody else. And so depending what the nature of your business is or what exposure you might have from the release of information, that's a harder one to mitigate, other than, planning ahead for that possible contingency and working that into your decision tree. So in other words, is this going to be there's because it's embarrassing to me? Well, one way to deal with that is, don't keep caches of embarrassing information. There's ways to mitigate that. Keep your information with a notion that somebody might see this someday, whether it's an internal memo, on something, or the photographs, that you keep on your computer. Say, could I survive if this information, were leaked? Would it injure my reputation? Would it expose me in ways that I just would find unbearable and I'd have to, hide in a basement? Or is it so, is it of such value of intellectual property, and my business depends on my unique access to this, that if everybody had it, then no one would come to me. And I think there's ways to mitigate that as well. So, it's all going to be risk reward in that decision. I think the fundamental starting place has to be, look, this is not literally a gun to my head. We think of it that way. It feels that way. It's scary. The monster pops up on the screen. It's our personal or professional stuff. It feels like an existential threat, but it is not the same as a gun to the head. So you're going to be able, and the more preparation you do, the more options that you're going to have. And then it's going to be about pain tolerance, to some degree. Can you afford to to be spending a lot of time and energy, dealing with the problem, to access the backup, sort of recreate things that were lost? What's your pain tolerance? And what are your ethics? And what will be the consequences for the exercise of your ethics? And I don't say that lightly. And I hate to keep using analogies, but, when we had organized crime in the Eastern District of New York, where I used to work, operating on a very aggressive level, decades ago, what advice, if you were in the Justice Department or the FBI, would you give to a small business owner in a neighborhood that was controlled by organized crime, where their family lived and worked? What advice would you give to them, when the mafia shows up and demands their cut? You would say, well, don't pay, you're supporting organized crime, perhaps, but you would be very sympathetic to a person in that position. And I think we've seen expressions of sympathy from the government, but we're at a point now, gentlemen, where sympathy's not going to cut it as a national or individual strategy to deal with the problem. It may not be, in my opinion, a true existential threat, but it is very much a material threat to our national security and our individual, safety.
So speaking of that, then, Seth, how helpful or in what situation should you get government agencies involved? Because we've seen some of the big stories like the Colonial Pipeline, where obviously that was affecting millions of people's ability to get oil and gas on the Atlantic coast. And so that got escalated very quickly, and you had the White House involved and main justice. But can you go a little bit it's a broad question, but can you get a little bit into that decision tree about when and where and how to get the government involved?
Yeah, well, look, sometimes it's simple because the law requires a notification under certain circumstances. And, I know Phil in particular has a lot of experience guiding clients through that kind of checklist of, what state am I in? What industry am I in? What is the nature of this attack? And what do I just have to do under the law? So sometimes there will be, sometimes you were just required by law to notify certain authorities of events that happen to you, painful and awkward as that may be. But in many cases, you're not, and it'll be a judgment call. And, I think a lot of how you want to be analyzing that decision, again, you can do with prep work. Government agencies are doing a tremendous amount of outreach. They're trying to find synergistic relationships with the private sector. This is not new, but it's become, even more urgent of late. And look, we're all, the three of us, spending a lot of time trying to build that empathy between the government and our clients, so that expectation management, is a big part of productive relationships. The government wants to help. Corporations and individuals are understandably wary of government presence, simply because it means a loss of some control, right? So, when you report something, you lose some control over what's going to happen next. I mean, when I was on the other side of the table and trying to encourage corporations to report, the incentive I tried to use most often was, look, there's a decent chance we're going to end up talking eventually about this, particularly if it's a significant event. Eventually people are going to find out. So how do you want that conversation to start? Do you want, me as the U.S. government calling you and you reacting to that while you're dealing with a lot of other stuff? Or do you want to come to us on your own terms with a concise summary of accurate information, which could potentially be helpful to you and will almost undoubtedly, Matt, be helpful to the collective effort? The government operates in good faith in the notion that it does not want to leave victims worse off than it found them. I mean, I can say that with confidence. And we've started to see, I know Phil's brought to my attention recently some cases where the government, various regulators, are becoming a little less forgiving and a little less sympathetic, than maybe they were a few years ago, and starting to scold, sometimes, fine companies where they felt like they either moved too slow or not accurately enough. So maybe it's a long lawyer's answer to what should be a straightforward question. But I think you contact law enforcement when you yourself have some confidence that what's happening to you,
right,
so that you can communicate effectively. And ideally, when you contact law enforcement, you're calling somebody you already know, because you've established a line of communication, either directly or through outside counsel that you work with, to a known player in cybersecurity space, whether it's at the FBI or DHS or TSA or some other entity. You're talking to somebody what information will be helpful to them, and you have some sense of what's going to happen now. And unfortunately, it's as much as they want to, the government can't always come to your rescue. It may be a very sobering conversation about what means are available. But it's not hopeless. I mean, sometimes the government is able to do things that others are not, to protect you and to protect us all, more collectively. So I would say call them when you have some sense of what's going on. Ideally, you're calling somebody certainly call them if you're required by law. And ideally, call them through a lawyer who has some experience working with the government, so you don't poke the bear unnecessarily early and complicate a situation where you're probably just trying to get an understanding yourself and mitigate, whatever injury is happening.
Yeah, I think this kind of emphasizes, what you've already touched on, and I know that the three of us preach this a lot, is, it's the preparation, right? Cybersecurity is just like any other compliance issue. You need to assess your risk. You need to see where your holes are, and you need to mitigate against that. And then you need to have a plan for how to handle when something goes wrong. And, I think we see a lot that companies get into trouble when they don't spend the necessary resources, although I think that's becoming less common. I think companies are seeing this, are understanding the value of spending the money, but also just having simple, incident response plan.
Yeah.
That, three of us have talked about all the time is who you're going to call when something happens, and either calling somebody in the government or calling one of us who has those relationships like you do. It's just so critical in one of these matters.
Yeah, and I think for cyber challenges, because of the technical nature, and there's other areas of law certainly that require technical sophistication, but I think cybersecurity especially really requires kind of a team approach. You have to have internal experts that know how to communicate appropriate to their level of responsibility. You have to have sophisticated outside counsel and perhaps subject matter expert consultants, to help you deal with the particular threat. It's very hard to find in one place all the solutions you need for the myriad complications and potential problems that can arise, from a cyber attack, ransomware breach, or whatever it is. So it's assembling that team, I think, on the front end, and getting that team to communicate effectively is really important.
So Seth, when we talk about cybersecurity issues and ransomware and a number of the challenges that are out there, and maybe the different threat levels that the whole the marketplace, that society in general are kind of acclimating to, is there anything that we can take away from what's going on to feel hopeful, optimistic? What's going well that should give people a sense that, hey, maybe there's a solution here?
Yeah. And look, I think there is a lot going well. I mean, we're not in the business of fear mongering, and I think that's really important. The fact that the conversation has become so mainstream is really important. It is becoming, a kitchen table conversation. And so the technical barriers to the conversation are starting to fall away. And so it's the behavior that people needed to engage in, and the expertise. I mean, everyone knows, I think it's a very much a growth industry across sectors to have expertise in cybersecurity. So I've been very encouraged by talking to the consultants that we've worked with, that on, what I would call the white hat side of cyber, the good, honest, decent people who have the technical expertise and want to work with us and protect us. They're leaning in, they're growing, they're smart, they're fast, they see the problem, they're out there. And the same thing, with the government, they're drawing talent, they see the problem. They've been, candid lately about, trying to find a kind of a holistic and flexible approach, to working with victims. I think, we're in a little bit of a shock moment right now. If you look at how the media is, Matt, maybe you pointed out, or Phil, I don't recall, but it's you open up the newspaper, it's another ransomware attack every day. So right now, unfortunately, I think we're in collectively the, oh my God, what's happening to us? Like, what is this thing? So we're at a bit of a fear spike, but I think what will follow from that, and frankly, the way it did with the terrorist attacks on our countries 20 years ago, and I don't think this is equivalent. I think that was a much more severe, threat to our country and climate of fear 20 years ago. And ultimately, we came up with responses. The country became resilient. People shared in a sense of responsibility, to deal with a common threat. And we came through better for it. And so I think while we're at perhaps an early stage in that evolution, I do see a lot of encouraging signs.
And I think, it sounds like we'll be even better off as soon as, people really do stop clicking on pictures of kittens and, offers of free trips to Hawaii. So thank you, Seth. It's been great chatting with you today. We appreciate having you on Sidebar, and listeners, thank you for listening. If you want to subscribe to Sidebar, you can find it wherever you subscribe to podcasts, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, gentlemen.